I'm Seth Chandler. I'm a professor here, and I'm the director of the Health Law and Policy Institute. And I'm going to be very brief at this time because our first speaker, Sheriff Adrian Garcia, will need to depart shortly. And although you will be talked at during this workshop, I very much want it to be participatory. If you look at the guest list, if you look to your left and to your right, you're going to see people who are very knowledgeable in this area and who will have frontline responsibility in the event that something unfortunate happens. We also have a number of dignitaries here, including Congressman Gene Green, who I'm going to ask to say a few words following my remarks. So, just to sort of get us rolling, it turns out that there are actually a lot of legal and practical issues that arise if a potentially apocalyptic threat comes. So our speakers today will be addressing that. Adrian Garcia is the Sheriff of Harris County, and he's going to be addressing the preparation of law enforcement on the streets, in courts, in prisons, things under his jurisdiction in the event of a serious outbreak of a communicable disease. Allison Winicky is a research professor at the University of Houston, and she spearheaded the production of the book that you have in front of you on control measures and public health emergencies, and she may, if we test her, be able to recite all of Chapter 81 of the Health and Safety Code from memory. The other actually interesting thing about Professor Winicky, and she's usually too modest or too traumatized to mention it, but she is actually personally a survivor of bioterrorism. She was hit with anthrax during 2001 during a stint on the Senate, while, ironically enough, doing work on emergency preparedness for bioterrorism. And so I feel like Allison, in addition to her academic knowledge, has a good personal understanding of the issues raised by massive disease or biological threats. David Pearce is the Public Health Authority for the City of Houston Department of Health Services, and as you'll hear from Allison and from him, that gives him very important responsibilities, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts on issues to be confronted in this metropolis and beyond from communicable diseases such as Ebola. There are lots of questions, lots of issues beyond quarantine that are implicated by Ebola Zaire. So what if your Médecins Sans Frontières guy comes back from heroic work in Guinea and wants to continue work as an ER doctor, maybe asymptomatic, but some of his co-workers are scared, and there's a question about what to disclose to patients. So Kevin Troutman, who is a partner with Fisher & Phillips, which I should mention was just named National Law Firm of the Year in Labor and Employment by U.S. News, is here to provide guidance on how the American with Disabilities Act and other laws apply to workplace situations. So I want you to enjoy this. This is not school, this is a workshop. And most importantly, feel free to ask questions. We've left a fair amount of time for that. And I found that crowdsourcing, particularly in an area where we're all kind of growing and learning, actually works. So with that, let me ask Congressman Green, if he wouldn't mind, to come down, say a few words, and then I'll turn it over to Sheriff Garcia. And can I pass you the baton? This is the microphone baton, which is now hooked to my glasses.
Okay.
There you go.
I think I can talk loud enough. Can everybody hear me without this? Or here, I'll get back to you. Oh, okay. Oh, it's for the camera. Okay. Okay. One, I apologize. I have, like Dean, I didn't find out about this seminar until 2 days ago. But I want to thank both the Law Center, but also the Institute for doing this. I'm a member of Congress who is a neighbor. I represent right across the freeway. And our district is one of the highest in the country of people who don't have access to health care. By federal definition, a lot of our district is medically underserved, even though we have a great medical center. And but I found out one thing today. I can't fit into chairs like I used to because I was a student here in the 70s at the Law Center and undergraduate from University of Houston. I know Jim Leitner and I both grew up in the same neighborhood, and University of Houston Law School was where we got our legal education. But I want to just work with the Policy Institute on what we do in Washington because I serve on the health subcommittee, and I will be there for my whole career because of the issues in our district. People ask me what I do. I said I work on energy and healthcare. Energy because I have East Harris County. I have the Port of Houston. I have refineries, chemical plants, and thousands of people who work there. But I also know that our district is healthcare challenged. And my goal is to make sure folks can get to the quality health care they can without having to go through Bentom emergency room. And that means they need to have a health care product, and whether it be Medicaid, whether it be health insurance or whatever. But again, thank the Institute for doing this and appreciate the information. I'll make sure my staff who handles health care gets this, because Congress' only reaction so far is we had a hearing in the middle of October, our Oversight and Investigation Committee from the House side on what was going on in the middle of October. But now, time lets us settle in and find out how we really need to respond. And I was proud earlier this week of Texas coming up with some reasonable ways we can deal with folks who may be infected with Ebola. But there's a reasonable way we can do it, and I think what Texas has done is good. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Put this around your head, and that way the camera will track you.
All right. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for this workshop. I think given all that's occurred and all the conversations, all the news that we've seen, it is critical that we best understand this. But it's good to see Dr. Purse here. And also I want to recognize my general counsel who will stay after I have to leave, Jim Leitner. Now, when we look at all the law enforcement and first responders in the room, I want to do two things. One, I want to separate the issue of bioterrorism and the issue of a virus. Bioterrorism, as we may be well aware, my old partner was the special agent in charge of the Miami field, FBI field office when anthrax was our challenge there. And we know that that's a very directed, very overt action taken by someone to affect a community. The virus, on the other side, is something that is extremely hard for first responders to contend with. And however, this is not our first rodeo. You got to remember that we've had issues related to SARS and H1N1. And those respective practices, as the sheriff of Harris County, have been very critical to our success and our ability to be prepared for the challenges that Ebola may bring to us. First of all, when you think about the sheriff, why would they ask the sheriff to provide some conversation today? Not only do I have the jurisdiction of 1,700 square miles and policing over 4 million people in Harris County, but I run the largest county jail in the state of Texas. On any given day, I've got about 9,000 people in my daily custody. Every day we intake and release on average about 300 people a day. We intake. And so that is, one of the areas that we have to be extremely prepared to contend with as it relates to preparations and understanding and things of nature. And that is probably one of our greatest strengths, is that how do we screen folks coming in? We do an incredible amount of medical screening, and we have done that for forever. And so we're very good in that regard. However, like SARS and H1N1, we started to elevate our attention to symptoms and making sure that we were understanding those and that we were prepared for contingencies in relation to whether those symptoms were related to those types of viruses. However, when you look at these guys in uniforms and my deputies and this officer, imagine the circumstance of witnessing, as we probably all have, a traffic accident happened right in front of us. And we'll be touted heroes because we're going to jump out of our patrol cars. We're going to go over there and put our hands on people. And if the case necessitates, we're going to do CPR and maybe mouth to mouth, because we're trained to save lives. that is probably our greatest weakness as it relates to this. And so we have had to pay a great deal of attention to doing all we can to mitigate where we may be called to respond. So we've got protocols set up in our call center. We're asking questions. We're trying to understand what the circumstances may be, trying to pull critical information out so that we can prepare our staff as they respond to a particular call and location and circumstance. But the biggest challenge is that day-to-day action that these first responders contend with on a daily basis. Our firefighters, our paramedics, that is where our greatest vulnerability exists. It is where people need us the most, but where we have the least opportunity to be extremely prepared and preventable to contamination and contact with someone who may be infected. But and then we've run into circumstances, understanding what occurred in Dallas and this is why it's good to have a general counsel who's got some military background. We have to understand our capability, our legal capability, that assume we get to a location and we think that there is something related to someone who may be infected. Not necessarily crimes occurred, but we've been called. That's generally the way things happen. We get called to location and someone in there says, oh, they're sick, they've got fever, and they got all this bad stuff happening to them, and we're worried. Okay. We know the situation, but the challenge then becomes, how do we contain it? If that person doesn't want to be contained. Think about that. So it's good that we have some bizarre movie makers that help us think through those circumstances, but that's what we have to be thinking about. And then imagine that your first responders are not the people prepared, like Dr. Peirce and others, to do the most precise type of diagnosis. What if it's just someone who's got a real bad case of the flu? And so all of this range of circumstances is what we have to contend with. But at the sheriff's office, given the population that we have, given the dynamic of our operations, there's probably not a hallway you'll walk through where we don't offer all the sanitation, chemicals, and we have our inmates, sanitizing the cells as much as we can. We're working a great deal in that regard. We've set up additional protocols on our intake process, and as I mentioned, we've set up protocols on our call center so that we can understand calls coming in. But this is where having people like Dr. Arafat working for the City of Houston's health department, being the person who tracks viruses in our communities. That's a capability that people don't often talk about, but it's a capability we have, and it's extremely important that we have, and that we figure out how to better leverage those circumstances. The conversations that I've tried to have is, how do we, today it's Ebola. What is it tomorrow? And understanding that we, at least this community, is a very internationally diverse community, and most internationally diverse in the country. Oh, there's Steve back there. Dr. Arafat works for that gentleman. But also the fact that our economy depends on the success of people coming and going from different parts of the world here. And so, we can protect our community, but we'll crater the economy. We can shut down flights, but we won't have much of a livelihood around this place. So these conversations, these workshops, and how to work through all those circumstances are extremely important. But I want you to just store in the back of your mind the challenges that our first responders have on the daily and dynamic circumstances that we confront on a daily basis. Car wrecks that occur, gunshot victims that are out there, and people expect us to do, before our paramedics can arrive, to do more life-saving overt actions on people that we engage, even the suspects that we engage. There's a lot to be expected. We have latex gloves, and my patrol deputies now have latex gloves and masks and all that. But there's a little bit of debate, and I don't know whether it'll be discussed here, but there's a little bit of debate in terms of the equipment that first responders have throughout the country, and that is that our weapons of mass destruction suits are extremely effective with bioterrorism. The question is do they protect us effectively for viruses? And so I think that's a conversation that may come up at this point. So with that, I want to thank you and thank the Law Center for having this conversation, but we can never have enough of these. And as I mentioned today, we've had conversations about weapons of mass destruction, and don't think that Ebola can't, migrate in that direction. We're fortunate that someone hasn't thought about dropping a vial in the middle of a busy downtown intersection. But these are the kinds of things that we have to be prepared for, and having the capability of being able to track viruses and symptoms throughout a community and be able to understand that and respond to it is our greatest level of protection, so that we can know how to contain and track those things. Exercises that we've gone through at the Sheriff's Office is really to understand that whether a virus or bioterrorism, you have to, in pandemic, I sent a meeting request to talk about pandemic, and I got a response back going, I think you mean Ebola. Pandemic kind of threw me off, and I said, no, I mean pandemic. Because this is kind of where we're at. If we understand what is the possibility of something like Ebola, even in the innocence of where we've seen it in our state, even in that innocence. In other words, someone came here, got infected. They didn't mean to get infected, but they were, and they didn't understand their level of infection and contaminated others, and then it goes on from there. That's an innocent circumstance. And then, as I mentioned, someone who may want to drop a glass vial in a busy area at the Galleria, for example, that's where we transcend into other attitudes and other ways of responding to this. But today it's Ebola. It was H1N1. It was SARS. What's it going to be tomorrow? And so the way that we make sure that our equipment is irrefutable in terms of its protection of our first responders, but we also have to realize that our first responders are family members, and so there are individuals who have newborns that are going to have to think through challenges of, well, if I go do my duty and come home and I've got a newborn at home, those are things that we have to really think about. And then we also have to understand that until we can contain and effectively put some issue to rest, there's a possibility that a workforce on the first responder level or anywhere else could be affected by 40% plus. And so how do we sustain our community, understanding that our workforce could be damaged or rendered ineffective to a certain extent. So, and then lastly, with the county jail, we have gone on quarantine before because sometimes we'll find things that are, scabies as an example. We have to quarantine our inmates and deal with those kinds of things. So we've had those exercises, but nothing to the magnitude of what something like Ebola could bring to us is worrisome. It is something that we have to have these collective bright minds helping us think through. And so with that, I hope I didn't set a low tempo to the conversation. I hope it stays lively. I hope we have good dialogue. But in this room are some incredibly gifted and intelligent people that I know that will help us think through all the respective challenges that may be before us. Thank you very much.
Sure. The sheriff's volunteered. He would be willing to take. He's got to go. So if anyone has a good question that they can state briefly, this is your opportunity to ask the sheriff. I'd be happy to have some good questions from our audience here. All right, we've got one.
I have a question about personal protective equipment. What sort of resources do you guys have to be able to purchase the kind of equipment that may be needed?
Well, on two levels. One is that for my patrol deputies, it's a good thing that I run a jail because I've got purchase orders open for latex gloves and sanitation products and things of that nature. On the other hand, and I hope you all have a conversation about the question of our protective gear. What do we call them, Doctor?
Protective suits.
Yes. I hope we have a conversation on that to really understand whether those suits truly do provide all the necessary protection or not. Because if we don't, I've got nearly 5,000 employees. And I'll be conservative, about 4,000 that would need them. I don't have the money to buy 4,000 suits today, nor is the production available for them.
You had mentioned that there are about 300 inmates that are being processed through the county jail each day. How are you managing processing that number with those screening for symptoms and things like that?
Yes, we have set up protocols asking for places of visit and things of that nature. Pretty much all the standard protocols that you may be familiar with already. We go through those. We do an extensive amount of medical screening already. One of the interesting things is that today we have the capability to match our medical records with the public hospital system. So assuming that someone has been treated for something in the free world and then all of a sudden becomes a guest of my hotel, there's a good chance that if they've been treated in the public hospital system, there's a good chance that we can share that data and make sure that we fully understand that in spite of someone and not necessarily answering the questions truthfully or not. And that's probably another a critical factor is do people and will people answer the questions accurately and truthfully?
I represent the hospital.
So thank you.
I'm quite familiar.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. So that's a capability we have, and that's a capability we're trying to expand to other systems in the future.
One more question for Sheriff.
Sure. Discussion touched on workforce protection. In the case of a true outbreak or the beginnings of an outbreak where there's a certain level of misunderstanding and fear, how do you envision critical resource all your officers? How do you envision being able to maintain workforce efficiency? Make sure that people aren't staying home because of the worry about or staying home because of maybe sickness or family. So what are you taking steps against the person to deal with workforce efficiency?
Yeah. First of all, anybody remember Hurricanes Katrina and Rita?
Yes.
Okay. I was working for the mayor's office at the time, and so I was asked to get my office ready to contend with this. And so I asked a couple of questions. I asked, who's got military experience? And then I asked, who cannot commit to being here when the wind is blowing and the rain is coming and the windows are shattering and who cannot commit to me because they feel an obligation to their family, and that they believe that that is, where they have to be, and that is what is the most important thing for them, and that they couldn't do, a family emergency plan that would, give them comfort to continue on with their duty. Almost half of my office said, I have to be with my family. And that's a hurricane. And so the honest question is going to be that I think we're going to have, incredible people with their hearts in the right place that will do their very best to show up. But on the other side, if we have staff that we identify as being contaminated or infected rather, then there will be a ripple effect because we'll have to, quarantine that partner or that, that office, and it will have a catastrophic effect. There's no doubt. And so it forces us, and we've had conversations about what if all of a sudden I have something happen in the jail and now I have to quarantine inmates, but now my employees have to be quarantined as well. What if, how does all that work? There's no simple answer. And when we were at the height of our overcrowding in the county jail, there were other communities that were saying, hey, because there was a business model to it, hey, send me some of your inmates. We'll be happy to handle your overflow. They won't volunteer if I say I've got to quarantine and I need to send some other inmates away. No one's going to volunteer for that. So there's no simple answer, but there will be possible decisions or critical decisions that will possibly have to be made, like maybe not making arrests in certain categories. We've had to go through those exercises. So there's a number of things that none of it will be pleasant, none of it will be perfect, but it will help us stay afloat the best we can while we get through the immediate dangers and circumstances of what we may be confronted. No simple answer.
Well, thank you very much, Sheriff. I know you've got to go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. The Sheriff, I think, challenged us and maybe sobered us on some of the hard practical issues about how to respond to something as serious as an Ebola outbreak or even the fear of an Ebola outbreak. And I want to talk right now about what makes Ebola not just a hard medical problem or a hard logistical problem, but a hard legal problem. Let's take the case of an individual who has a 1 in 1,000 chance of being in the infectious stage of Ebola. Maybe they returned, or maybe they're a student here who returned from Sierra Leone because a family member died there. Or maybe there's someone who came in contact with they were 2 seats away on an airplane from someone who had Ebola. So their risk is low, but it's not zero. What do we do with them? What does a workplace do? And how does the government act in the event that they want to invoke personal control measures? Now, if that person were a product, and there was a 1 in 1,000 risk of it killing somebody, or worse, killing 100 people, there is no question what we would do. We would not let that product out into the wild. We stop airplanes from flying if there's a 1 in 1,000 risk of a crash. And airplane risk is not communicable. The problem with a 1 in 1,000 risk of Ebola Zaire, or Ebola of an unknown strain, is that if it materializes, then you have the potential for lots of people to come down with the disease. And so even if we control it quickly, so there is only a 1 in 100 risk that those other people spread it to others, there is still a substantial risk. Let's say you have 20 friends with whom you come in contact during some borderline period in which you might be communicable, but either not so symptomatic that no one would go near you without a spacesuit, or suppose you're communicable and symptomatic, but as the sheriff pointed out, there may be issues about the protection offered by protective gear. And so the risk of transmission to them is 1 in 1,000. What happens? Well, probably nothing. Probably none of them get it. Indeed, that's where we kind of appear to be today. We had a little blip. It wasn't a blip for the people involved, but from a big picture standpoint, it was a blip. And as I'm standing here today on November 6th, 7th, lost track, things seem to be okay. But what if one of them does get it, or a new human vector is introduced? And what if that person is someone who happens to have a lot of friends, or they deal with the public, they're a surgeon? And the risk isn't 1 in 1,000 then, it's 1 in 50. Again, what happens? Again, most likely nothing. Ebola is not yet the flu. It doesn't spread like that, but the difference between it and our flu today is its lethality. And while we as a society are equipped, perhaps unlike the Western African nations where it has struck, to deal with a dozen or 24 cases of Ebola Zaire, as the sheriff pointed out, are we really prepared to deal with the medical, social, economic, and collateral health consequences that will occur when 1,000 people have that disease, or 10,000? Are we even prepared to deal with the fear, as the sheriff pointed out, that might come from just a dozen cases? Of course, people aren't products. And a lot of what I say depends on the mathematics of epidemics when the actual parameters are unknown and dynamic. The cold fact is that when people are put into quarantine, the consequences are serious. Their employer may have no obligation to pay them. They may be isolated from family and friends, or worse, confined with them. They may have trouble taking care of their children or elder parents. And they, perhaps like others who have been conscripted into the military in years past, will be asked to put their lives on hold or even at risk for the greater good. And the threat of quarantine on return may deter heroic individuals from going to attack Ebola where it is most fierce. So right now, though, instead of more theoretical meanderings, it's time to get down to the law as it actually is. And I'm going to ask Allison Winicky, a research faculty member, to come up here. I venture to say that Allison does know more than most human beings on earth about Texas law on the subject, and ask her to present to you what is the actual law today in Texas on protective measures. Thank you.
That's not it. All right, good morning. Today I'm going to talk about quarantine law and isolation law in Texas to give you an overview of what the laws are so you'll understand the major legal issues as well as the application of the public health control measures we use in Texas. So this is an outline of the things we're going to go over today. First, we're going to talk about what are some public health control measures, briefly cover state versus federal jurisdiction, and then I'm going to talk about the responsibilities of the executive as well as the role of the courts in Texas when it comes to public health control measures. And last, I'm going to go over some new CDC and Department of State Health Services guidance. So let's start off with some public health definitions just so we're all on the same page. We have quarantine and isolation, restriction and detention. Those are all related, and we're going to go into those in more depth. Another control measure is immunization. A person or a group of persons may be required to be immunized against a communicable disease. We have decontamination, disinfection, disinfestation. These are all related to removing infectious agents. We have chemoprophylaxis, preventive therapy, and prevention. And these are all preventive measures. Chemoprophylaxis, that's related to taking a medication to prevent catching an infectious disease. And last on the list, we have education. which is, again, another valid control measure. And so these are the control measures that are listed in Texas statute, but it's not an exclusive list. A health authority can take any control measure necessary to protect the public's health. So let's move on to the important definitions we need to distinguish. Despite what you may have heard in the media, quarantine and isolation are not the same thing. In fact, they apply to two different groups of people. Quarantine applies to healthy people who may have been exposed to an infectious disease. And these people are not sick and they don't look sick. As long as a health official reasonably believes that this person may have been exposed to an infectious disease, then this person is a candidate for quarantine. And the point of a quarantine is to stop people who might be carriers of a disease from spreading it around to the rest of the public when they don't know that they're infected. So now let's move to isolation. This is different from quarantine because people in isolation are already infected with a communicable disease, or more specifically, they are reasonably believed to be infected. So some of the differences between the two. A healthy person is in quarantine. So what health officials want to do is monitor them for however long the incubation period of the disease is to see if they actually come down with the disease. For Ebola, the incubation period is 21 days, but the quarantine is based on scientific evidence for whatever the particular disease is. So for another disease, the incubation period may be longer or shorter, and the quarantine would be appropriately adjusted. And the second thing that health officials want to do during a quarantine is possibly keep the individual separated from the public during the incubation period so they don't spread a disease that they might have. Contrast that with isolation. This person is already sick. Depending upon the disease, isolation measures may involve medical treatment to combat the disease, as well as just keeping the person separated from the rest of the community so they don't spread the disease. So now I'd like to discuss the different governmental divisions who have legal authority to implement quarantine and isolation measures. First, you need to know that states have primary responsibility for protecting the public's health. Through the police powers reserved to them by the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, states have the authority to protect the health, safety, morals, and general welfare of the people. And this power from the state can be delegated down to local authorities to make decisions responding to local health needs. And the federal government actually has limited authority in this area because it's limited by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to regulating international and interstate transmission of disease. So the federal government cannot impose a quarantine within a state unless, for some reason, the state's disease control measures are inadequate to control the spread of disease, and it will spread to another state. So the federal authority to quarantine only applies to the infectious disease has been listed in an executive order. And there's a list, and it includes cholera, diphtheria, tuberculosis, plague, smallpox, yellow fever, the severe acute respiratory syndromes, and viral hemorrhagic fevers, which Ebola is one of those. Another federal power that they have is that the Secretary of Health and Human Services may declare a public health emergency. So Jacobson versus Massachusetts is considered the seminal case in public health law because it reaffirmed that states have a legal authority to use their police powers for public health concerns, including control measures such as immunizations, quarantine, isolation, or even closure of facilities during an emergency situation. So what was at issue in the case is whether a mandatory smallpox vaccination violated Mr. Jacobson's 14th Amendment right to liberty. And the court held that the law was a legitimate exercise of the state's police power to protect the public health and safety of its citizens. The court noted that an individual does have protected liberties under the Constitution, but those liberties may be restricted when the safety of the general public may demand, so long as the measures taken by the state are necessary to protect the public's health and are not unreasonable and not arbitrarily imposed. And to quote from the opinion, they say, there are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. So now that we have the legal basics down, let's move on to who holds responsibility in Texas for protecting the public's health. The governor is charged with coordinating disaster response and requesting federal assistance if needed. He may declare a state of disaster if a disaster has occurred or the threat is imminent. And under such a declaration, the governor has very broad powers, and he can suspend laws, and any orders and proclamations made by the governor during this time have the full force of law. And this state of disaster can last up to 30 days unless the governor cancels it beforehand, or it can be renewed by the governor after 30 days. You see that once the state of disaster is declared, it initiates the state emergency management plan. And the governor also has the authority to order the evacuation of affected areas. And if the governor determines that Texas cannot handle this public health emergency on its own, he can ask for a presidential declaration of emergency under the Stafford Act. And there's a similar type of declaration I mentioned earlier that the HHS secretary makes. The governor, if the secretary makes the declaration, the governor is tasked with working with the secretary to coordinate the disaster response to the public health emergency. So next we have the responsibilities of the Texas Department of State Health Services. The commissioner of the department may declare a public health disaster if there's immediate threat from a communicable disease that, one, poses a high risk of death or serious long-term disability to a large number of people, and two, creates a substantial risk of public exposure. And this public health disaster cannot last longer than 30 days, but it can be renewed once by the commissioner. Also, another responsibility they have is that they define the reportable diseases that local authorities report up to the state. And during a public health disaster, they can expand that list to include more diseases. They also investigate disease cases, and that's one of the roles that they've taken up in Dallas with our Ebola issues. And they assist local health authorities in doing the same thing. So now we have the local health authority. The local health authority is a physician who is also a state officer with a 2-year term of office. And oftentimes, the director of a local health department or a public health district, if that person is also a physician, is the local health authority. So the health authority is required to do a few things. They have to establish, maintain, and enforce control measures within their jurisdiction. They have the same ability as the Department of State Health Services to implement control measures. The one exception is if the local health authority wants to declare an area quarantine, they need to consult with the commissioner first. Also, they have to report any dangerous, contagious diseases back to the department that occur in their district. And like I mentioned before, like the Department of State Health Services, they're also tasked with investigating disease cases within their jurisdiction. So if the Department of State Health Services or the local health authority reasonably believes that an individual is infected with or has been exposed to a communicable disease, they may order the individual to implement control measures that are reasonable and necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, spread of the disease within the state of Texas. And so this is what we like to call written order of control measures. So the steps that one would need to take to get the ball rolling for these control measures is first, the department or the local health authority identifies the individual who's been exposed to the communicable disease or infected with the disease. Next, they order the individual to implement control measures. And like I said, this isn't just quarantine or isolation. This is any type of control measure like we mentioned on the early slides. Any control measure that will stop the spread of disease. And the order must be in writing and delivered personally or by mail to the possibly or infected individual. And the order is effective until either the individual is no longer infected or the incubation period has expired. And I want to make a note that, in these examples, we're focusing on an individual needing quarantine or isolation, like possibly for an Ebola infection. But everything here also applies to groups of people, property, animals. They can even quarantine an entire area. And you'll find all of this information is in your bench book. So failure of an individual to follow the control measures issued either by the Department of State Health Services or the local health authority is a Class B misdemeanor, which is punishable by a fine up to $2,000 or up to 180 days in jail, or both. If those subject to the written control measures comply voluntarily, the role of the judiciary is minimal. But as we have seen in some accounts, voluntary compliance with control measures is not always the case. If a person does not comply, then they can be brought before the court and ordered to submit to control measures. And the court plays an important role here in ensuring that the individual's constitutional rights to liberty are balanced against the needs to protect the public's health. So now you have an individual who you believe should be quarantined for public safety and has disregarded the control measures ordered. What is the next step? Now's the time to get the judicial system involved with a court order for the management of a person with a communicable disease. And this is sought for judicial enforcement of the control measures. And remember, it's not just for quarantine, it's for any of the control measures we mentioned. If the local health authority is seeking this order, what they need to do is make a request to the local city, county, district attorney, and they can file this motion on their behalf in the district court wherever the individual is located. If the Department of State Health Services is seeking the order, they make a request to file to the Attorney General, who also files in the same district court. And so the application must include a medical evaluation, which is signed by the Commissioner of the Department of State Health Services, and a statement that the individual poses a threat to the public's health. And if you're requesting inpatient treatment, you don't have to request inpatient treatment, but if you do, you also need to include a copy of the written order that you sent them before and a statement that says they did not comply with the order we already sent. So once the application is filed, the judge must appoint an attorney to represent the individual within 24 hours, and a hearing must be set within 14 days. And it can only be held within the first 3 days of that period if the individual does not object. And during that time, the individual is entitled to remain free unless they are under a protective order, which we will talk about in a minute. And if necessary, at the hearing, protective gear may be worn by the judge and the court and everyone there, or they may elect to bring in the patient via video teleconference if they feel like that's a safer alternative. So if the court finds the individual is infected or reasonably suspected of being infected with a communicable disease and they fail to follow the control orders, the court can designate care at either a designated inpatient healthcare facility or another disease management program, and that includes just staying at home. So what if you can't wait 14 days for a hearing because the individual is an extreme risk to the community? You can file for a temporary protective custody order before you file for the previously mentioned order for the management of a person with a communicable disease. And a judge may issue a temporary protective order if he or she takes testimony that you will file that order with, for the management of a person with a communicable disease and a protective order the next day, and the judge determines that there's probable cause to believe that this person represents a substantial risk to the community or himself, and the person cannot be at liberty while waiting for the filing of this application. So if the judge does issue a temporary protective order, the individual must submit to examination, observation, isolation, and/or treatment, whatever was determined by the Department of State Health Services or the local health authority. And note, this is a temporary protective custody order, and it terminates at 4 p.m. the next day unless you actually file those forms that you promised to file the day before. So finally we get to a regular protective custody order, and this is issued when the individual needs to be taken into custody to stop the spread of disease. And this is going to be issued if the judge finds out that they issued written orders but they were not complied with, the individual is or is it believed to be infected with a communicable disease that will really threaten the public's health, and the individual is likely to cause serious harm to self or the public if not taken into custody and examined, observed, isolated, or treated. And also for a protective custody order, I wanted to note that you also need the medical evaluation, the same as you would with the order for the management of a person with a communicable disease. So if the protective custody order is granted, then a peace officer, an ambulance, and/or an EMS staff will take the individual into protective custody and transport them to an appropriate inpatient health facility. And because this is a real severe restriction of liberty, a probable cause hearing must be held within 72 hours to determine if the individual really does present a substantial risk of harm to self or others that would preclude them from being free while a regular order for the management of a person with communicable disease is being discussed. So now that we've gone over some of the procedural methods to implement quarantine and isolation measures, I wanted to bring us back to the Ebola issues that we're facing today. So the CDC released some new interim guidance for monitoring and movement of people exposed to the Ebola virus. They put people into 4 different categories to determine what sort of public health action should be taken. As I mentioned earlier, these are federal guidelines, and they don't necessarily apply in Texas, but the CDC are experts in public health, and most states give considerable weight to their scientific recommendation. So in the high-risk category, you have people who have actual exposure to body fluids of an Ebola patient. I say Ebola patient, but this also means a symptomatic Ebola patient, a patient who can easily transmit the disease. And so we're talking about needle stick, mucous membrane exposure. If you have exposure without using some personal protective equipment, if you have contact with the dead body of an Ebola patient in the 3 countries that are most affected by Ebola, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, or if you lived in the immediate household and provided direct care to an Ebola patient, no matter where you live. If you're in the some risk category, That means you have had direct contact with an Ebola patient while using the full personal protective equipment in one of the 3 affected countries, or if you've had close contact, which they define as being within 3 feet or 1 meter of an Ebola patient in households, healthcare facilities, or community settings. And now in the low-risk category, to get in that category, that means you traveled to one of the 3 most affected countries within the past 21 days. Maybe you had brief contact with a symptomatic Ebola patient, just shaking hands. That will put you in the low-risk category. Direct contact with an Ebola patient while using personal protective equipment. This includes healthcare workers in the United States are in the low-risk category. And the last in the low-risk category is if you traveled on an airplane with a symptomatic Ebola patient. And the final category is called no identifiable risk. It used to say no risk, but they updated the guidance to say no identifiable risk, I think just to cover themselves in case they find something. But that is if you traveled to one of the 3 affected countries more than 21 days ago. So now that we have the risk categories, what are the public health control measures? So first off, I want to point out that this chart is for quarantine candidates, people who are asymptomatic but who may have been exposed to Ebola. All the guidelines say that if you are symptomatic, you go into isolation right away. So we're just talking about healthy people who might have been exposed, and these are what we might do in quarantine situations. So for high risk, the CDC recommends direct active monitoring. And so that means that the health authority comes to their home and directly observes the individual. They take their temperature, they look at them for any possible symptoms, and they do that once a day, and then later on in the day, the person takes their own temperature, calls in and says, hey, this is my temperature, I'm feeling fine. And also, on high risk, you're restricted from public activities. You're not supposed to go out in public. You're not supposed to ride the bus. And same for travel. You're not allowed to travel. And the CDC actually does have a do not board list that they can put you on. Next, we get into the some risk category, where the monitoring is the same as high risk. Someone comes to your house, takes your temperature, looks at you. Later on, you call them and give them your second temperature. Now, for restricted public activities and restricted travel, it's possible. The CDC recommends this be done on a case-by-case basis to determine the risks involved. And then we get to the low-risk category. And this is a lower level of monitoring. They call it active monitoring. And that means that the individual takes their temperature twice a day, calls in twice a day, and says, this is my temperature, I'm feeling fine, or I'm feeling sick. However, there are 2 categories of people who are in this low-risk category who get a heightened level of monitoring, and it's those U.S. healthcare workers who are treating Ebola patients in the United States. Then you have to go back up to the direct active monitoring, which is more stringent. And also, airline passengers are in the low-risk category. But if you're an airline passenger who is sat within 3 feet of an Ebola patient, you also are bumped up to a higher category. And then you see for the no identifiable risk, there are no restrictions at all. So now I want you to contrast the CDC recommendations based on their scientific evidence, and those recommendations you just saw were released on October 27th, with this new Department of State Health Services system for monitoring and restriction of healthcare workers returning from West Africa. And these were unveiled on October 31st, last Friday. So these recommendations were actually proposed by the new Texas Task Force on Infectious Disease Preparedness and Response. And just this Tuesday, Governor Perry ordered the Department of State Health Services Commissioner Lakey to implement these recommendations. And so these are this is from their recommendation. And first, I want you to note the difference. These recommendations are only for healthcare workers returning from Ebola endemic countries in West Africa. We'll have to wait and see if when the department actually implements the measures, that if they broaden that to include anybody. But the specific recommendations only reference healthcare workers. And also you'll see there's an extra column here for a control order for quarantine. They put in some recommendations for implementing quarantine in Texas under the laws that I have already mentioned. And so I highlighted in red some of the differences that these recommendations have made that are different from the CDC. So for high-risk individuals, what they recommend is that a public health official meet them at the airport as they arrive and takes their temperature. The local health authority must be notified immediately and make an in-home visit within 12 hours of them coming back into the country. And a control order for quarantine is automatically submitted, that the patient must submit to. And it restricts them from any public activities, and it restricts their travel. They are not allowed to leave the home, and they're going to be placed on that CDC Do Not Board list. And they must have their temperature taken twice a day in person by the local health authority, which is a little bit more stringent than the CDC guidelines, which only had the health authority come visit you once a day. So for the some risk individuals, again, a health authority is going to meet you at the airport to take your temperature. The local health authority is going to come visit you in your home within 12 hours of you returning. These individuals are also restricted from public activities, whereas the CDC said it's a case-by-case basis. These recommendations say, no, everybody's restricted from public activities. And for monitoring, this is an interesting difference. They do the same as the high risk, the 2-a-day in-person local health authority monitoring, but only for the first 14 days. The last 7 days, they do their 2-a-day monitoring via Skype. And in their recommendations, they actually use the word Skype. Or I'm sure any video conferencing way would work. So for low risk, they won't meet you at the airport. But they're still going to come and visit you within 12 hours of you getting back into the country. And they're going to do a 2-a-day Skype temperature taking session with your local health authority. So there have been some high-profile cases in the news, and let's see where they might have fit in this chart if the recommendations would have been followed, which I know they weren't because they just came out last week. So we have the Liberian man who flew to Dallas. He flew to Dallas in September, but he didn't start getting any symptoms until 3 days after he arrived in Dallas. So if these guidelines would have been followed at the time, what sort of category would he be in? He came from Liberia. That's one of the 3 affected countries. And he had physically carried a woman who had Ebola, so he possibly could have become in direct contact with some of her bodily fluids. So what category would that put him in? That would probably put him in the high-risk category. And so when he came, he would have immediately been monitored, had the health authority at his house within 12 hours. So possibly more preventive measures could have prevented his death. So now we had some healthcare workers in Dallas who took care of the patient, 2 of which became infected with Ebola. Luckily they survived. But one of those 2 infected nurses, she traveled by plane interstate from Texas to Ohio and back. And a 3rd was not infected, but she was quarantined on a cruise ship. So if the Dallas healthcare workers were wearing the appropriate personal protective equipment, which I can't speak to if they were or not, there's some little, there's some controversy about whether that was the case or not. But if they were, they would probably be in the low-risk category because they were healthcare workers wearing personal protective equipment in the United States caring for an Ebola patient. So because they were healthcare workers, they would still have the more heightened direct active monitoring, which is more stringent. But they wouldn't have had their public activities or travel restricted under the CDC guidelines. And what about the most recent case of the nurse, Casey Hickox, who was quarantined in New Jersey, and then she was quarantined again in Maine, and she fought her quarantine through the courts. So she treated patients in Sierra Leone, and that is one of the 3 affected countries. So if she was wearing personal protective equipment, which I assume she was with a major organization, Doctors Without Borders, that would put her in the some risk category. And under the CDC guidelines, it's a heightened monitoring, possible restricted public activities, and possible restricted travel, which is on a case-by-case basis. So we don't really have time to go over all the CDC guidance in detail, but I wanted you to have the links because they have some really good information that's being updated constantly. We already talked about the monitoring and movement guidance. They have really great personal protective equipment guidance, including videos showing you how to properly don and doff your equipment. They also have excellent EMS and 911 guidance, which talks about some of the questions maybe a 911 dispatcher should ask before they send the EMS out to the scene to maybe prepare them to put on their personal protective equipment ahead of time. And they have some emergency department evaluation, an excellent chart that if you work in an emergency room, you really need to pass this out to everybody. It's basically a flow chart that tells you how to triage these people if they come in. Infection control information, and they also have some good human remains guidance because remember, Ebola can still be transmitted after death. And so anyone who handles the body, from the coroner all the way to the funeral home and the mortuary, they all have to wear full personal protective equipment. And the Department of State Health Services also has some guidance and they also link to some CDC guidance as well, but this is some of the guidance that they've prepared on their own. Hospital planning, emergency triage. They also have some good EMS resources and a school district tip sheet to help school districts. And they have guidance on housing and monitoring dogs exposed to Ebola because that actually happened here in Texas. Even though I checked and the CDC says that there have been no accounts of dogs or cats contracting Ebola either here or in West Africa. So there you go. So we have a few minutes for questions. This was just an overview, but I hope you'll find all the details in your control measures bench book. It includes some really great flow charts of the entire process, as well as excellent sample forms at the back, including a written control measure order and filing applications with the court.
All right, so we've got some time for questions. If you could keep them brief, that would be wonderful. Yes, down in the back.
If you go back to the risk levels that the CDC publishes, it says contact with dead body of Ebola patient without personal protective equipment in the 3 countries. Don't you think that people who handle kind of stuff inside in the United States without PPE were exposed to the high risk level?
Yes.
Ebola doesn't.
I know. All I can say is that that particular thing was not specifically listed in their guidance, but I think that it's fine to say that if you came in contact with a dead body without personal protective equipment, you should probably be in the high risk category. Yeah. Because because what that is, I believe what that is possible exposure to body fluids of an Ebola patient. Because you just don't know if you don't have the right personal protective equipment.
Yes, Greg, welcome back.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question. On the violation of a written order of control measure, which includes confinement in jail as a potential penalty, is it necessary to go through all of the steps, the court order steps, or if a person is violating just the basic written control order, can the authorities simply arrest them for a violation of a class B misdemeanor?
That is a good question, whether the violation of a Class B misdemeanor, you can just take those steps to enforce it.
Right. So the question is, you haven't been served with a court order, you've simply been served with an order from a Department of Health saying, stay in your house. Right. And you decide, like Casey Hickox, that it would be far more fun to go on a bike ride, okay? Can the police at that point arrest you for violating the Texas Health and Safety Code? And Allison, I am subject to question by you or by anyone here. I was reading that during her talk because I thought it was such an interesting issue. As I read the statute, yes, you can be arrested. You don't need to be served with a court order, that the mere violation of the order from the Department of State Health Services is itself a crime. Yes, Chairman.
In light of the main ruling on Cdc Guidance, can the DSH's requirements for the restricted public activities for the summons categorically challenge granted? Or do we have to all that would come to a case in the Texas court system?
No, I would actually.
Could you just repeat the
Oh,
question?
sorry. He said that if, because of the main ruling with the Casey Hickox case, excuse me, can our recommendations be preemptively, yeah, so I believe the answer is no, because the state of Texas has authority to implement its own recommendations for control measures in Texas, and frankly, they don't really care what they're doing in Maine.
Right, but where's the point of can be preemptively challenged and be challenged before we have a case that meets those requirements?
Why don't you say it?
Not necessarily do we need to follow Maine's ruling, but can it be preemptively challenged?
And by preemptively challenged, you mean by a person who doesn't have a condition, who thinks that the guidelines are unfair and they want to challenge its constitutionality? Is that what you're saying?
Something like that, yeah.
I would say that's unlikely that they would have standing to make that challenge. I think we're going to need a more particularized person who actually is in jeopardy. So
That's right.
my own sense is no. Gentleman there, and then I'll come back to you. Dr. Wright.
I'm Dr. Esco, Health Authority. So we have an intersection of very difficult and challenging issues because, yes, we know that these folks have some risk, but the example of the bike, if she goes out there and she does not have symptoms and doesn't have fever, we can't go on the stand and say that she's a risk of transmitting disease to other people because she's not. She's potentially at risk if she develops symptoms while she's on the bike ride, but that's the only case where she would have risk of transmission. So we've got the reality of the situation and the potential of the situation, which are very difficult to rectify. So how do we address those issues?
Right. Well, what I think is the issue here about, potential things that could happen, like with Casey Hickox going on her bike ride, and that's really addressed a little bit in the guidance because part of it is restricted public activities, and that's, being in a group of people within 3 feet. And so you could even have in your order, you cannot go out into public places, into public conveyances, things like that. But if you're riding the bike alone by yourself on a country road and you're not going to meet anybody, that doesn't even really violate the order because I wouldn't consider that that's not a threat to the public's health because you're not really meeting any of the requirements to transmit Ebola.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Let's say they go and they arrested you and said, you violated the order. If we go in front of the judge and the judge says, Dr. Escott or Dr. First, is this person presently at risk for spreading disease? The answer is no. How do you treat somebody right when they have no actual risk of transmitting disease to other people?
answer your question? Why do you think that if they're sitting next to someone at a Texans game and there are people 3 feet or less away from them, how is that different from their being on an airplane? Some risk of transmission just through casual touching, and they've got sweat.
That's a great question. Then we go to Patrick Monrovia to Liberia, to Lagos. He was sick on the plane, vomiting on the plane, fever on the plane, collapsed in the airport in Lagos. None of the people on the plane got sick. And it's because of the difficulty of transmission early in the disease. And it's because of the need to have mucous membrane exposure to bodily fluids. So the answer is, the risk is not zero, but it's pretty close to zero.
Right.
Based on case history.
Right, and that's why that would put them in the low risk category. But you, as a local health authority, you can say it's not a zero risk. It's a low risk, but it is a risk, and that's why I want you to enforce this order.
I mean, the argument I would make on your behalf, if you wanted to quarantine that individual, would be to say that, yes, the risk of transmission is low, but Ebola is not the flu. It's not a mild disease, and you might want to multiply the risk of transmission with the harm from transmission. And the harm from transmission is not just to those around them, but to the derivative people in a network around those people. Because once this thing gets going, as I said in my remarks, it really does turn into, as the chief was saying, or the sheriff was saying, that's a really serious problem. So I would say you argue, yes, the risk is low, but it isn't zero, and the harm is quite large. Dr. Lowe, you had your hand up earlier. You had your hand up?
No, he actually asked my question.
Okay, great. All right, we'll take 2 more, yes.
Okay, I had a question about the DSHS restrictions on healthcare workers returning to West Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, I have 2 questions actually, brief. As far as West Africa is concerned, is that limited to Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone? Have they expanded that to include additional countries, or have they left it essentially?
Okay, so the wording they use is actually different from the CDC. The CDC uses widespread transmission, and they list those 3 countries. In their recommendation, they use the word Ebola endemic countries. So it is sort of, smaller than all of West Africa, but they didn't actually list the countries.
Right, and then I also had a question on the low risk in that category. So are they indicating the only low risk that I could see being in this case would be a healthcare worker that was not working with Ebola patients? Is that would be considered low risk in the state restrictions?
Yeah, the categories of risk between the state's recommendations and the CDC are exactly the same.
We've got time for one more question. And this gentleman, one here. Yes.
Okay, I was just going to ask, we were just curious about how the measures are going to affect the reporting, the self-reporting. So one of the things that I was just curious about, because they've identified 3 countries, is the health authority allowed to expand that at all? Because it's not really, it's a guideline. So if they decide to travel to another country and it's not documented that they were in the other country to begin with, one of the 3 identified, then can that be extended to other countries?
And by way of example, someone goes to Mali. They're in the Peace Corps and they go to Mali, or they're looking for gas and they go to Mali, where there's one case, maybe a little more. And you want to know whether a local health authority could consider that person in a heightened category of risk.
Yes.
Or Nigeria, which is a much more likely country of transit for Houston. All right. Allison, I'm going to give you that great question.
Okay, so the local health authority, and you're talking about reporting to the state, or just your own control measures? Okay.
Because at the airport, I think that you have the authority then now to report their names to local authorities, even if you don't, confine them at that point.
Right. Well, according to the state guidance, they say Ebola endemic countries in West Africa. So if it's a country that's not within these Ebola endemic countries, then you don't really have the authority to expand it and be like, oh, this person was in this other country that's kind of close, I think that you probably should follow the department's recommendation and not try to expand it out on your own.
Do you guys foresee that as happening as a problem though? Because I'm not really thinking of a healthcare worker who probably, or a police officer. I'm thinking more of an individual who may have gone there for a funeral or been in contact with the dead body when they were sick, knows that these restrictions are now in place, tries to travel to another country so that they don't have to face isolation.
Well, I do know that on the federal level, they have actually, folks that are traveling from those infected countries, they actually route them through 5 specific airports into the United States. So theoretically, that problem is taken care of.
All right. I'm going to keep us moving. I know these are lots of interesting questions, and I'm sure there are many more. Let me ask Dr. Peirce to come up and do his presentation, and we look forward to hearing his remarks. Thank you, Allison, very much.
Thank you. Okay, for you?
Are you gonna walk around the line? If so, I need to put a little mic on.
No, I'll stay here. I'll stay here.
Okay, while we're getting the slides up, I first want to thank Professor Winnicky and also apologize to her for my getting up and leaving. And I think the door made a little bit too much noise as I left. But one of the things that I'd like for you to understand in the city of Houston, I'm going to talk about how we respond. I'm in the unique role, I wear 2 hats with the city. I'm the public health authority, and you've heard about what that means. I'm also the EMS medical director. And in situations like that, that is rather serendipitous, because if we have a Ebola patient who sort of comes up on our radar through a 911 call, the first people on scene will be either a Houston police officer or a Houston firefighter. And it is our policy, as it has been for several weeks now, that if they come upon a case where they think they may have an Ebola patient, they are to call me. Now, we have physicians that cover the fire department on 24-hour shifts for all critical cases. And I was on call yesterday, not on call today. And so when the base station called me, I first ignored the call because I'm not on call today. And then when they immediately called me back, I thought, what are the chances? And so yes, while you were talking, I got up to take a call, first time in 2 weeks now. Right in the beginning, I was getting like every 12 hours, but I haven't had any for about 2 weeks. And yes, just now while you were talking, we had a case where we thought we might have had a patient infected with Ebola. It was a gentleman who had just traveled from Africa who had a headache, no fever. They took his temperature, and it was 98.4, so he did not have fever. He had headache, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, but he had been in Nigeria. And so they, the firefighters, probably not having a map of the continent of Africa in their mind, or maybe because they were remembering about the situation in Lagos, they called in and we went through a quick screen and determined that he was at no risk. But let me apologize to you for going, but I think it was rather serendipitous and it fits. So, I want to, before I get into my slides, and you all get copies of the slides, I want to talk a little bit about Ebola 101 to put some of this in perspective, and it kind of will go, I think, to Dr. Escott's questions. When somebody becomes infected with Ebola, the virus, it's a nasty virus, we know that, but it's nasty and it's sneaky. And so as the person is infected with Ebola, this virus, like all viruses, will infect a cell, and a virus really is a piece of either DNA or RNA, depending on which virus it is. In this case, it's RNA, and it's got a protein shell on it. And so during flu season, when I try to educate people about the flu, I say, think of it like an M&M. The chocolate is the DNA, and the candy coating on the outside is the protein shell. Okay? So if you think of a virus like that, and the Ebola virus like that, it will get into a cell, it injects the chocolate into the cell, which then goes to the mechanisms within that cell to make more DNA or RNA, and it just turns on those mechanisms, making copy after copy after copy. It turns into a little Xerox machine and just makes as many copies as it possibly can until the cell ruptures and dies, and now there's millions of viruses that spread and basically do the same thing. Now, viruses also have a tendency to sort of like some tissues and not be too interested in other tissues. The flu virus and like the cold virus, the Rhino virus, it loves our sinuses, okay, and our ears and our upper throat. The flu virus loves our lungs and not much else. Okay, so when you hear people talk about the stomach flu, there really is no such thing as the stomach flu. There are other viruses that circulate during what I call the viral season that will give you nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, but they're not actually the flu. The flu really likes your lungs. It really doesn't care much about your stomach. Ebola likes your spleen and your liver, and it really doesn't care a whole lot about your lungs. It likes your blood vessels, and it likes your blood. And so when you're first infected with it, it goes to the spleen and the liver and starts infecting cells in the spleen and the liver, making millions and millions of copies of itself, rupturing those cells, and then going out and infecting others, okay? And so that's when you're asymptomatic. You've been infected, but you're asymptomatic. At some point, you develop enough virus that starts getting out into the blood system, and it starts going and irritating the lining of the blood vessels. This then sets off your inflammatory response, which is when you start having fever. So when you start having fever is when the virus is first entering and starting to populate the blood system. So that's why fever is so important. And that's why prior to that you may be infected, but you're not really contagious because it's really kind of hunkered down in the liver and the spleen. Unless you go and stick your finger into somebody's liver, you're probably fine, okay? So you're not contagious then. Now, it's important because I think as we're talking about law, and I am not a lawyer, so take none of my legal advice, but I think it's important, and kind of goes to Dr. Escott's question, the flu is different. You're actually contagious with the flu before you have symptoms. And a lot of the laws that we're talking about, and again, I'm not a legal historian either, they were written at a time when the public was acutely aware of the dangers of illnesses being transmitted like measles and polio and smallpox, all right? And so that's, I think, if there's a legal historian, please correct me, but I think that's where the mentality is. And so Ebola is the one that's a little bit different because for the first time we're looking at something that's really ugly where you're not contagious before you have symptoms. And that's the only thing, I think that's what leads to the confusion. And I actually support the way our laws are written, and my personal bias is that if we put an imposition on somebody and quarantine them at home before, or tell them they can't ride their bike before they become symptomatic, they could certainly see that possibly as an injustice, but the consequence is so huge that we're going to have to pay a price. And as a society, we're sort of deciding which price do we want to pay. You're not going to get out of this, and it's not going to be perfect. This is like sausage. In the end, it may look good, but Lord knows how it gets made, right? And so there's going to be some ugly things that are going to be going on. But I think that it's helpful as we have this discussion to sort of understand a little bit about the virus and how it works. The other thing we talk about is that, well, I'll get to this, I'll save that later, but it's not airborne, and that goes to the fact that the virus doesn't really like your lungs a whole lot. When you get sick enough, it's in the lungs, trust me. It's everywhere when you get sick enough, but not early on. So, oops. All right, so let's talk about what we have in the city of Houston, how we're trying to get things set up for you if we get a call through 911. So as was mentioned earlier, our call takers today, it's not like on television. 911, what's your emergency? Oh, it's my Uncle Tom. I think he's having a heart attack. Oh, I need an ambulance. I need it now. Thanks, bye. And before the next commercial break, he's in the intensive care unit. Okay? It's not like that at all. All right? You call, the first thing, and for everyone in here, this is a little bit of 911 101. When you call, the first question they're going to ask is, what is the location of your emergency? And the reason for that is in case you panic and hang up or the phone line gets interrupted for some other reason, we know where to send somebody to find out what's going on. So the first question they're going to ask is, where do you live? And they don't necessarily know your neighborhood. So if you say you live across the street from the Kroger's in Meyerland, that doesn't narrow it down, okay? You really need to know, I live at 123 Main Street, and then they're going to ask you, what's the name of the street at the corner? So that's Sycamore, and I'm making this up, right? But you need to know where you live, and most of us do. But what we don't know is, like, if I were the one who had to call 911 right now from this room, I really don't think I have a good idea to tell them how to get here, right? I would have to ask for help. So if you're ever calling 911, recognize that's one of the first things they're going to ask, and you may want to plan ahead and get some specifics about where it is that you're located, okay? We do today have the ability, if you call from a phone that has a cable coming out or a wire coming out going into a wall, we'll have an address. They may just ask you to confirm, are you at the U of H Law Center in the auditorium? In which case you can say, yeah. But if you're on a cell phone, depending on where you are, that may or may not happen. Technology today does allow us to triangulate. It takes a little bit. some parts of the area are covered better than other parts of the area. So don't rely on that. Know where you are. So that's going to be the first question. You know, what is the location of emergency? And they're going to go through some, you know, what is the emergency? And, you know, you can go anywhere from it's a motor vehicle accident to I think my teacher's got Ebola and I need to get out of a test. I mean, I think my teacher has Ebola. So, and don't laugh. That has happened already. Okay. Also, I need to get on my DUI. That's happened already. The sheriff and I were talking about that. But anyways, so they'll ask a little bit about the emergency. Then we're going to ask, is the person conscious? Are they awake? And then are they breathing normally? And then depending on what you said, whether it be pediatric fever, chest pain, motor vehicle accident, there's a couple of other questions. None of that has changed. But what has changed is after we then get the troops going, we've got ideas of what's going on, and we send resources, we will now ask, if it sounds like it's a medical question, we're not asking it right now on the shootings and the stabbings, but we are asking on all the medical type questions is, does the patient have fever? And have they traveled? And if so, where have they traveled? And if it turns out that they've got fever and they've traveled to one of the 3 countries that we're concerned about, then the call taker types into the computer and sends a message to the responding units that this is a potentially infectious disease patient. We don't say Ebola. We're not making diagnoses. We're saying this is a potential infectious disease risk patient. And then they know they can either put on their suits or not before they get in. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We are coordinating with the hospitals. We're talking to them and talking. We're drilling with hospitals, the fire department, HFD. We are drilling with their hospitals. We're creating training videos from those. And we're within the city limits of Houston, there are about 40 hospitals with emergency departments. And so we're trying to work with the hospital systems as opposed to each individual hospital, but we are willing to work with any hospital that asks for us to come and do a drill with them. And we're doing them ad nauseum, which is really good because every time we do them, we find something else we can improve upon. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the public health tracking of patients and the thing called Unified Command. So I already talked about this, the now on call taker. And the EMS response. So depending on, we have a tiered system, which means depending on how the emergency sounds when it first comes in, you may get an ambulance by itself, you may get a fire truck by itself, or you may get the cavalry. It sort of depends on how serious the emergency sounds. Regardless, somebody is going to get there first. Even if we send the cavalry, somebody is going to get there first. And the way our system is set up, it's most likely going to be a fire truck, because there are many more fire trucks than ambulances, and our ambulances tend to be busier, so they tend to be less available at any given instant. So it's most likely going to be a fire truck. Now, the people on the fire truck, they move back and forth. They work on the ambulance one day, and they work on the fire truck the next. They're cross-trained, dual-role individuals, and quite capable of working on either vehicle. And so when they get on scene, if we think it's an Ebola case like just happened, and as I mentioned, their first thing to do is to back out and call me, and we'll go through the case and decide whether or not we need to respond like it's an Ebola case. If it is, had they said to this gentleman, exact same story, except he just came from Sierra Leone, then right now we'd have our guys getting all suited up. They would also call for, again, depending on who got there first, they'd be calling for the remainder of making sure that there's a paramedic unit, a basic ambulance, an engine, and a supervisor. Would all be notified. Hazmat would be notified, and the physician on call would be notified. And all of those would respond. The physician, maybe not, depending on whatever else they were doing, because we've only got one covering the entire city, but probably for a case like this, they would respond as well. They would get into their full suits, and we've got a picture actually of one of our guys. This is during a drill in the back of the ambulance, and they get in the full suit. And we recognize that it's not airborne, but we get fully suited up anyways, as if it were airborne. And the reason for that is that our folks are working in the most uncontrolled environment. In a hospital, you have some control over the environment. In the EMS environment, we have no control over the environment. You're walking into people's homes where they work, into a park, a parking garage, you name it, an industrial setting. With cases like this, we sort of anticipate most frequently be at somebody's home because they don't feel good, so they didn't go to work, right? So they're not likely to be at work, but they're going to be at somebody's home, which means they're going to be family members, and emotions are going to be high, especially if everybody in the family now thinks that somebody has Ebola. They will either be really, really concerned, or they're going to be really, really ticked off that you came back. And because now they're worried about their other family members. And so emotions are going to be very high, and they're probably not going to be neutral. They're going to be either really, like I say, either really concerned or really angry. And we've come across it. We've had that happen already. Family members tend to act out. Patients who are not feeling good and are scared that they have Ebola, and now their loved ones are turning against them, they get quite emotional too. And they can act out. And then there's the dog, who just notices that everybody's ticked off. And then these people come in these moon suits. Oh, we're not having that. All right? You got to get people downstairs. Right? There are trip hazards, so on and so forth. And then the other thing is that remember that our folks that are going to be out there, whether it's in the moon suits or not, it's Houston. So it's hot and it's humid. And what do you tend to do when the sweat is about to pour into your eye? You do that. What's the last thing I want one of our firefighters doing? I don't want them able to touch their face. And then the third reason is that with our hazmat folks, when we're going to be doing decontamination, and this is actually a picture in the bottom right, and I'm sorry I'm standing in your way. There's a picture in the bottom right of our folks getting decontaminated, and the gentleman in the foreground is with the hazmat team, and he has a wand, and he's spraying a light bleach solution on the outside of the firefighter. This is one of our drills. And because the virus is very sensitive, it does not like bleach. It's killed very quickly with bleach. But if I'm just wearing, safety glasses and a surgical mask, and you spray my face with that, that's not going to go over well, right? Right. I mean, you could actually hurt somebody's cornea. Not only is it going to sting, but it could actually damage them. So for those three reasons, we're putting our folks in the airborne protection level, not because we think it's airborne. But that contributes to the confusion. Because as I said earlier, when people are, before they're symptomatic, the virus is populating in their liver and their spleen. When it does get into the blood and their temperature starts to go up, they become potentially contagious, but at a very low level. And this is why Mr. Duncan's family members who lived with him for 2 or 3 days, why they didn't become infected. It's not, the virus doesn't spread. Can it spread? Absolutely. Is it easily spread at that point? No. But the healthcare workers both in West Africa and in Dallas, they were caring for these patients when they became extremely contagious because every body fluid was teeming with virus, and it only takes a tiny little bit to get past those protections. And so this is why there's a lot of confusion about this, right? And we inadvertently, we're the fire department here in Houston, we have a case, we will probably add to that confusion, but at least the people in this room will now have some idea as to why. It's not that we're overly scared, it's that we've got some practicalities we got to work around. The transfer of the care occurs at the hospital. It's going to occur at the back door of the ambulance. We aren't going to do what we usually do and bring people in. We're going to have it occur at the back door of the ambulance. We will have called ahead and notified hospitals. One of the big problems that we fear is that, no offense to our friends from the media, but they're very good at getting angles of shots no matter how low, and we're going to try to protect some patient confidentiality. So that's one issue, but you know what, that's not our priority. Our priority is that we transfer care in an organized fashion, and the hospital wants to make sure they have control over what happens inside their building. We also don't want to inadvertently contaminate their building somehow. You have to imagine that our folks will have been in the home where there may be vomit on the floor, diarrhea all over the place, who knows what. So the outside of our suits, we will assume, are fairly contaminated. We don't want to go into the hospital. We'd rather have the hospital workers who are predominantly clean on the outside, they're just freshly in their PPE, that they will bring the patient into the hospital. We'll do our decon outside and let the hospital take control and take care of the patient. There's a lot of coordinations going on. I talked a lot about the hospitals. We're working closely with our CDC colleagues and the other health departments, the health authorities from Harris County, Montgomery County, Fort Bend County, Galveston. We talk pretty much, probably at least once a week now. We're talking and just comparing notes and making sure that we're all on the same page. We are all sort of faced with the conundrum that was brought up earlier about if we get a case, so the case is actually, at this point, from a public health authority standpoint, the case is easy. That they're going to go into isolation in the hospital and be cared for. It's who do we need to quarantine? And who should we quarantine, which are not necessarily the same group of folks, right? Because part of that question goes to, And this is what we saw in Dallas. Remember with Mr. Duncan's family, they were first on a voluntary quarantine until the next day when they sent their kids to school, which is a very responsible thing for parents to do, to send their children to school. What it says is not that they're malicious or that they were uncooperative. It means they probably didn't understand what quarantine really meant, right? So once they sent the kids to school, then all the dominoes started falling with communicable disease orders followed by court orders and all sorts of stuff. And so, part of this is we want to balance, as Dr. Escott points out, you want to balance the individual's rights with protecting the community. And the health authorities in the region, as we talk about this, we all sort of, jokingly point out that, these are going to be career-ending decisions, right? Right, because we're going to make this decision. We've been here before with H1N1. We felt the same way. But we'll make a decision, and no matter what you decide, there's going to be somebody with an army of people who feel similarly behind them who are going to say you made the wrong decision. But that's okay. That's the job, right? And each one of us, as we talk about it, we're pretty close on the same page. We think that we're all pretty much on the same page. But when it comes to this case, on this day, there are going to be particulars about that case. They're going to sway us one way or the other. And it's, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I am of the ilk that I am probably going to lean towards protecting the public and be a little bit more willing to step on somebody's individual rights. I would rather stand in front of a court and make that argument than stand in front of the court and say, well, I thought that, Nurse Casey really ought to be able to ride her bike wherever she wants, and now I've got 4 or 5 people that are infected. So it's kind of like, which way do I want to defend myself in front of the media, in front of the mayor, in front of the courts? And so I'm probably going to lean that way, just to let you know which way I'm going to lean. But it won't. But that's just the way. That's the job, right? That's what we're supposed to do. It's difficult. And efforts like this today. Not only was the timing of that call bad because it was in the middle of your lecture, but it was in the middle of the part of your lecture I most needed to hear. So I got the slides though, so hopefully that'll help. The other thing I want to talk about is once we have a case and we make the decision to quarantine someone or not quarantine someone, that's the sprint. We then enter into the marathon. And in the marathon, one of the things, and I was 2 nights ago, or not 2 nights ago, it was 2 nights ago, when I was on call, I got a call about 1:30 in the morning from the base station. It was a CPR case, and we got through it. But then I couldn't fall back asleep. And I got to that level where you're kind of awake and kind of asleep. I was awake enough that I could kind of control my dream a little bit, right? And I started having this dream that we got a call that there were 5 people in an apartment, and they all sounded like they were infected with Ebola. And so, of course, you know how dreams are. And the next thing you know, I'm there, and sure enough, there's 4 adults and a child, and they're critically ill, they're hypotensive, they've got vomiting and diarrhea, high fevers, one of them has blood draining from their eyes, and they just came from burying a loved one in West Africa, and they've been hiding because they're afraid. They're afraid of the establishment. They're afraid that if they came forward, that their family members would be put in quarantine. That would be this horrible, terrible thing. And so they just went into denial. It couldn't possibly be that I have Ebola. And so they hid. And this is a very real scenario. This could very easily happen, right? And so in this dream, I started deciding, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to, what are we going to do? So I made this decision. I'm going to send 1 patient to each hospital system. So the Memorial Hermann Hospital system is going to get 1 patient. Harris Health, that system is going to get 1 patient. Methodist Hospital system is going to get 1 patient. Texas Children's Hospital system, they're going to get the child. But we're going to sort of split it up that way, and hopefully that will maximally allow that individual, they'll have the maximum chance of survival because they're going to have the entire attention of that entire hospital system to care for them. And then I started to decide, okay, so who do I need to contact? And so I'm going to contact Stephen Williams, who's in the back of the room. He's our health director. Sitting next to him is Michelle Austin, who's our attorney. They're going to be like some of the first calls, okay? Because with Ms. Austin, we need to start talking about quarantine or isolation orders. What's the name of the order? Control orders, thank you. We just need to get the control orders written, and I'll be trying to think who they are. And then I'll be calling our counterparts over at County Health Department. We'll be talking with the mayor's office. And right here we have Rick Flanagan, who's the city's emergency management officer, coordinator. And I'm going to be calling him because we need to stand up the unified command. So a unified command we work on an incident command system, and if there's an incident and it's small enough, there'll be one person who's in charge. That's the incident commander, and then there's an org chart below that we use quite frequently for addressing either big projects or big problems. But when it's something this big, we're going to wind up having to have a unified command because we're going to have multiple jurisdictions involved. We have multiple areas of expertise that are going to need to come in. So like law enforcement's going to have to be there for obvious reasons, right? We're going to have folks with the hospitals because we've now sent these patients to multiple hospitals. Those hospitals are all going to have big demands in terms of PPE and waste and so on and so forth. And so this thing's going to grow very quickly, and we're going to enter into the marathon. The blood samples have to be drawn. We're hoping that very shortly here that our own local health department laboratory will be able to do this testing, and we won't have to send it off to Austin. But that's not yet. But we're hoping that's coming. The contact tracing. This is where our epidemiologists are going to go out, and they're going to interview the folks that these people have been in contact with. And so if they were hiding themselves, so the incubation period is out to 21 days. Mostly people become symptomatic between 8 and 10 or 12 days. And if they're as symptomatic as they were in my dream, they've probably been there for a week. So who have they talked to in a week, right? How did they get their food? Where did they go? I pray they didn't go to the Galleria. I pray they didn't go to a Rockets game. I pray they didn't take their kids to school. Because, one of the things that we've heard before is, there's nothing to fear but fear itself, right? So that is so true. That is so true. Because can you imagine if my dream, my nightmare, comes true, and they had gone to a bunch of different places. They went to the Kroger's while they were symptomatic, while they had abdominal pain and fever. They took their kids to school. They got on the bus. You name it. This information is going to get out. It's going to have to get out because we're going to have to engage the public to try and find out who we need to be worried about. And you can see how the hysteria could spiral up quite quickly, and that would be immensely problematic. And so, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to track all of those folks. Again, decide who needs quarantine. We've talked a little bit about enforcement. We've talked about the waste management. But under the unified command, pretty much every problem that comes from this will be funneled through that unified command. We've used it before. We've used it during our hurricanes. We've used it during we use it when the Super Bowl comes, right, Rick? We use it for all mass large events. So we're quite familiar with establishing the unified command, and we're going to lean on that pretty hard here. But one of the things that we will need is going to be the assistance from our legal minds, and I'm glad we're having this because we don't have all the questions answered just yet, right? But I think I wanted to let you know a little bit about what we have in place in terms of some operations. The health department under Stephen, whenever we have big events, and they do these a lot of major projects, going out into neighborhoods and providing services to neighborhoods. So the health department uses the unified command on a regular basis, or the instant command system on a regular basis. And so we're really very familiar with it. But most people in the community don't even know that this exists. And that's okay. There's no real reason for them to, but we've got it and we lean on it. And I think I'm ready to take questions.
Great, we'll take questions. And can I have the privilege of starting with one? Sure. Which is one of the things you mentioned is sort of, and it's perfectly illustrated by the call that you took, is the false alarm problem.
Right.
The early symptoms of Ebola mimic the symptoms of flu to some extent.
Right.
Would you agree that, we should redouble our efforts to get people to get flu shots so that they don't freak out EMS technicians and hospital people and police officers who are going to be the first responders? It's almost as a courtesy to those people and the jobs that they undertake that it would be a really, really extra good idea this year to get a flu shot.
No, you're absolutely right. And if we have the situation today it's easy because right now in the United States there's one Ebola patient in New York City, right? But if we have the situation that I sort of talked about where we don't know, we no longer can go by where have you traveled, then anyone who has symptoms would be someone who would be panicking. And so absolutely, if you can get vaccinated, that'll reduce your risk of putting yourself in a panic situation. where you wouldn't have those same symptoms. The ugly flip side to that is that then if I do get symptoms, then I'm really scared. But there's a flip side to that too. And remember that the vaccine is protective against the flu. But during what I call the viral season, there are lots of other viruses like the stomach flu that produce similar symptoms that the flu vaccine doesn't protect against. That's one of the problems that we have in educating people about flu vaccine is that, last year I got the flu shot and I still got the flu. Well, no, you probably didn't. You probably got one of the other viruses that, particularly if you got the stomach flu, which is not the flu. There are lots of viruses that go around. It doesn't protect you against everything viral. It will protect you against influenza. And so you're exactly right. But again, it's the public messaging. It's getting people educated. You had listed on one of your early slides about the control measures. And the last one was education. And I would suggest to people that's actually the most powerful one, is to educate people. And we live in a society today where information that the evening news, when I was younger, we had dinner at 6 o'clock. We all got together, we sat around, and we watched the news, the evening news. It was one of 3 channels, right, back then? Well, today, that doesn't happen, right? Kids don't get, in a lot of families, kids don't get together with their parents and watch the news because everybody's getting the news by their favorite internet thing, which is sometimes inaccurate. Anyways.
Let's take some questions. Yes?
Dr. First, harkening back to your role as medical director for EMS, you're potentially putting people in level 3 PPE. I think that's appropriate under the circumstances. Who's going to drive the ambulance?
Good question. So the role is whether an engine shows up or an ambulance shows up, there 2 people will be identified to care for the patient, and they'll get suited up, and they will get into the back of the ambulance, and we will find somebody else to drive. We're going to keep the cab of the ambulance clean. The patient compartment will become potentially contaminated. When they get to the hospital, they will step out of the ambulance to transfer care from their stretcher to the hospital stretcher. They then get back into the back of the ambulance. Hazmat will come on scene. They're going to decon the back of the ambulance. We'll then decon them. They will then go into the hospital to take a shower. They're going to get some paper scrubs. We're going to take all their clothes. We're going to put them in red bags, sit on them for 24 hours. By 24 hours, we should know whether the patient was infected with Ebola or not. So if it's not Ebola, they get their clothes back. If it is Ebola, they get new clothes.
Yeah. The person that's sitting in the driver's seat is not in level 6.
That's correct.
All of the nonsense.
Yeah, yeah. And as you can imagine, if you've ever been at level C, it's really difficult. You have like no peripheral vision, and you can't hear, so it's not a good driver. Right.
Yes, woman over there.
Is Harris County currently monitoring any potential risk at this time?
So I'm representing the city of Houston, and we have 4 patients that we have 4 people that the CDC has notified us. We've interviewed them. They're extremely low risk, but we're doing the temperature checks. Yep, yep.
Are your folks doing the temperatures wearing any particular
Nope.
protective equipment?
No, patients are asymptomatic, so no.
Yes.
It's my understanding that once a patient is diagnosed with Ebola, they're transferred to particular hospitals. One of them is in Galveston, where they have the proper equipment, supply, and training to deal with that.
So
If I can just repeat, a question related to where patients would be transported in the South Texas area.
right. So UTMB has been identified as a treatment facility. So whether a patient walks into the emergency department or they're called by 911, we transport them to a local hospital where within the first 24 plus hours a diagnosis will be made and confirmed. If it turns out that they actually do have Ebola, they would then be transferred either to UTMB or to the facility in Richardson, depending on where DSHS wants to send them. But we don't send folks to UTMB for the screening, if you will.
One more question, then we're going to have our final speaker. All right, hearing none, let me thank Dr. Peirce for his outstanding presentation. All right, we'll transfer the baton to Kevin Troutman, who will talk to us about labor and employment.
Thank you. While we get set up with the PowerPoint, I will tell you that I'm an employment attorney, and before I went to law school, I worked in the real world, so to speak, for 17 years. Was in healthcare administration, hospital administration, And so I've been on that side of things too. And I think that helps in these kinds of discussions. I've been really pleased and excited this morning to hear all the things that have been said. One, I learned a lot of things, but to hear how a lot of advice I've been giving details or dovetails with some of the advice that other folks have been giving, Dr. Person particularly, Sheriff Garcia, a lot of good things. And so I'll make some kind of important 30,000-foot points that I think would guide this whole discussion. One is that this is not our first rodeo for any of us, even on the employment side. And I'm going to focus on employment types of issues that have been coming up, because we've been getting a lot of questions on these kinds of scenarios over the last 3 weeks or so particularly. But whether it's H1N1, SARS, or other types of widespread public health issues or concerns or scares or whatever you want to call them, we've dealt with these things before, and we've even developed things like frameworks for plans, checklists, that sort of thing to help employers be ready. And not just employers, but to help businesses be ready because of the kinds of disruptions that can occur and because of the kinds of things that are likely to happen or things that may not be available, such as a lot of the workforce perhaps not being able to come to work for a while. So we've dealt with these things before, and this is not the last time that we'll deal with them. So it's a good opportunity for everyone to get ready, not just for Ebola, but for any similar kind of situation, because it will happen again. And it's much easier and much more effective to work from a plan that you already have in place than it is to try to come up with a plan on the fly. So some of the really important things for employers or any businesses to keep in mind is, one, we've heard this a lot already today, is as these situations arise, you want to do individualized, fact-based analysis of the situation. You can't generalize. If you jump to conclusions, that's where you're likely to make a mistake. So individualized types of analysis. The other thing is to have kind of a team already assembled who's going to be your response team in these kinds of emergencies. Have those folks available and designate a leader, someone who's going to take charge when these kinds of situations, health types of situations in public that affect the workplace, when these things arise, have that person ready to take charge. And third, talk to your employees about what you're doing. Don't just sit there and be silent, but tell your employees, we're watching this situation, we're concerned about it, here are some things we're doing about it, which leads to points that we made just a few minutes ago. Encourage employees to practice good personal hygiene, good personal health practices such as getting the flu shot, washing your hands frequently, covering your mouth the right way when you cough. All those things help make for a better, more effective, more healthy workplace. And in situations like this, it helps promote really good practices and good outcomes all the way around. So those are all things you can take from this discussion, not just from the employment point of view, but from any organizational point of view. Now, what I'm going to do with these slides is to move fairly quickly because a lot of my slides touch on a lot of the things that we've already covered. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through these things. I'm not going to go through every one, but you have the slides, and I think you have my contact information in there if you happen to have a question. But what I'd like to do is focus on a few scenarios and talk about what we can do to help, particularly with respect to employment issues. So as I mentioned, overreaction, that's one of the things we want to be real careful of. Look at your facts before you start to make decisions. If you have the plan, you're in a much better position to do that. And then what are some of the kinds of things that we may be able to do? I think I read yesterday that we've reached a point where the folks who were potentially exposed, the people who were being tracked in Dallas, have now reached the end of their monitoring periods. So when you look at this from a big picture point of view, things seem to be going pretty well. But there's always other threats out there. I work with clients who have supported employees of theirs who voluntarily went to West Africa to assist with care of these patients. And one of the things that they've done is as they brought these these employees back, is they've given those folks 21 days off with pay, so that there's no stigma, there's no punishment, no bad consequences for them going to do something really heroic to go help in an area where the help is severely needed. And they've tried to facilitate that, but do it in a way that protects everybody back home, and do it in a way where those people face no adverse consequences. So those are some things to think about. And you know, as we mentioned, if we get some exposures here in this country, if we get some diagnoses here in this country, or if it moves into other parts of Asia, this situation suddenly can become a lot more challenging for us here in the U.S. And as we said, it's okay to be scared, but we want to have a programmatic approach to how we deal with these issues. One of the things that's very important for us is to approach this as a risk management issue. As we talked about earlier, you have to weigh what is the potential harm versus the potential risk. And when the harm is as great as it is, you're going to err a little bit more on the side of caution. But when you deal with employment laws don't tend to be quite as friendly to employers as some of the other areas that we're dealing with, and they don't really reflect a better safe than sorry kind of approach. So it's important to keep that in mind. One of the things that we're constantly recommending is to follow the CDC guidance, and in this case now, the state and local health authority guidance, because if you follow that, you're not having to make decisions on your own as an employer. You're following the guidance from people who are informed and people who know how the situation should work, how the disease progresses, how it's transmitted, etc. The direct threat issue under the Americans with Disabilities Act is one that can be very difficult to prove as an employer, but the Americans with Disabilities Act is very much in play as you think about situations where your employees may be potentially exposed to Ebola or other infectious diseases. As we've talked about, this has come up before. So again, we're just back to the risk management evaluation of whatever the particular situation is. And when you're doing this risk management, again, determine disease exposure for each situation, and then apply whatever the applicable analysis might be. Now, you might not have thought of this, but look at some of the types of issues that can come up. Claims under the Americans with Disabilities Act, those things can come up as an employer. Race and national origin discrimination can come up. We've had situations where someone traveled to East Africa, came home, and there was this panic almost in some places. What do we do about this? Well, what do we do about this? This person is low risk or no risk from what we know right now. So what do you do? What would you do with anybody else who took a trip somewhere? Don't jump to conclusions. Get your facts and understand where this person has been and what they've been doing. And it's okay to ask employees where they've been. That's okay. But then don't jump to those conclusions, because if someone, for instance, has gone to a funeral, family funeral over in East Africa, and we suddenly decide that's an Ebola risk, and we bar them from the workplace, among other things, what have we opened ourselves up for? A potential claim for discrimination, maybe on the basis of national origin? So those are all things we have to think about as employers. Not that we're going to forget about the potential health risk, but the potential health risk and our assessment should be based on facts. We've talked about this. We've talked about the risk categories, but we don't want to lose track of these risk categories, because the symptoms of Ebola, the symptoms that are consistent with Ebola, are so similar to the other kinds of things that are likely to come up at this time of year, particularly flu season. So the fact that someone has fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, that does not by itself mean they have Ebola, and that's why it's important to keep these risk categories or risk classifications in mind. We've really kind of talked about this, but from the workplace perspective, if a person is symptomatic, you need to implement isolation. If the high risk or low risk person, or some risk, I'm sorry, is symptomatic, you need to notify the appropriate officials. You need to have a doctor involved and determine, does this person need to be isolated? In many cases, they will need to be if they're in one of those categories. But if they're asymptomatic, you don't jump to those conclusions. And one of the things, it's important here, public health authorities through orders, this is from the CDC guidance, public health authorities through orders may impose restrictions that include exclusion from workplaces. They may, but they may not. So again, it's going to depend on the individual circumstances and that person's risk classifications, whether they're symptomatic or not. So in this case, the fact that someone is even in some risk category does not mean that they're necessarily going to be banned from work, at least not necessarily. There's an article that we published on Forbes.com about 2 weeks ago that's included in your materials, and it provides kind of a good overview of things that employers ought to be thinking about when you're dealing with this situation. But again, not just with Ebola, with any kind of widespread health concern, whether it's an H1N1, SARS type of situation, or whatever it may be. In this case, we're talking about Ebola. I thought this was worth including, and especially this first point. This is from the CDC about colleges and universities and whether they should isolate or quarantine patients. And again, it just makes the point that I'm trying to emphasize is students, faculty, staff, and I'll say employees should not be isolated based on travel history alone. There has to be more than that. There has to be a deeper analysis, and that's going to be the important thing. So then, how do we use that CDC analysis or that CDC guidance and state and local guidance? How do we use that when we look at potential ADA situations? What about a traveler who's returning from an affected country? What if they're coming from that? Well, what did they do in that country? Did they just travel through that country? Were they involved in some type of closer exposure? Are they symptomatic or asymptomatic? All those things help guide us in terms of what we would do as an employer. What if they've traveled from East Africa? I made reference to that a minute ago. We had a question come up about someone who had been at a conference in which a speaker was literally pulled out of the conference right in the middle of his presentation because he was going to be isolated. The health authorities wanted to talk to that speaker who had, I think at that point, had been on an airplane with the nurse who had traveled and been diagnosed with Ebola. So then the people who are at the conference say, oh my gosh, am I exposed? What needs to happen to me? Well, the guidance says no, just being in the conference, just being in the same room, as far away as we are from each other, is unlikely to put you at any risk, certainly not at a higher risk or some risk category. So you have to look at, again, the facts and the circumstances. What about a coworker who just wants to talk about this employee who they work with who's traveled somewhere in Africa? They don't know where, they just returned from Africa. What do you do as an employer in a situation like that? Generally speaking, we always think it's not a good idea for employers to start talking to the whole workforce about another employee and their private business. That's a good starting point, but you do want to look into what's happening, and you have a private conversation with an employee who's maybe traveled into an area and you don't know exactly where or what they've done. That's okay. You can ask them about it, but you're not going to be wanting to give health reports about every person in your workplace to all the rest of the workplace either. You're going to have to handle that, which is why, as I said on the front end, it's important for you to have some kind of a communication in place with your workforce from the beginning, saying, we take this seriously, we investigate, we'll let you know what we're doing, we'll keep you posted, because you're not going to report to them on individuals unless you absolutely have to, because maybe there's actually been some sort of an exposure. What about medical inquiries and taking temperatures? Again, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, taking temperatures would be considered a medical examination. And the Americans with Disabilities Act only allows employers to do medical examinations under limited circumstances. So I'm going to go on to some other guidance that might be helpful. Somebody raised the question, though, well, is Ebola actually a disability under the ADA? Is it? Do we even have to worry about the ADA? Well, you probably do. And one medical commentator said it's likely that a person who is diagnosed with Ebola is going to have some sort of lasting after effects, and they probably would be considered disabled, so they probably would be covered by the ADA. Plus, the ADA provides that you cannot discriminate against or take action against an individual because you regard them as disabled. So whether they actually are or not, if you think they are and you treat them differently and single them out because of that, then they're probably covered by the ADA. So the FMLA is another situation that may come up in the workplace. A person may need to take time off because of their own condition, or maybe to care for a family member who has a serious health condition, whether it's Ebola or some other serious health condition. So again, that may come up in a workplace setting. If you do exams, an important point again is medical exams in the workplace and inquiries about medical must be job related and consistent with business necessity. You can't just willy-nilly do medical exams of employees. Well, job related, consistent with business necessity. In this case, you're probably going to be able to make that case, but you need to be able to think through it and be sure that you can actually show that is the situation. That's for your current employees. Again, applying the CDC guidance, you want to know the facts. What actions are you contemplating? Important point to keep in mind, what are your options? If someone, after you go through the analysis, maybe needs to stay away from the workplace for 21 days, maybe pursuant to a state or local health authority order, needs to stay away from the workplace for 21 days, do you have policies that say we're going to pay them? Do you have policies that say we can let them work from home? That's not going to work in every situation. Obviously, there are some jobs that you cannot perform from home, but there are some jobs that you can, and you want to be able to show that you've thought through that at least, especially if you don't pay the employee. But theoretically, even if you pay them, you've taken an action removing them from the workplace. So you want to think through it. You want to make sure your documentation reflects what you did and, just as importantly, why you did it. And then look at your risk. You may be willing to accept some of the risks that are associated with whatever action you decide to take. The EEOC has not published guidance specifically on Ebola, but they have published guidance on what to do when there are pandemic situations out in the workplace within this country. So we look to that guidance to help us decide what to do and how to deal with the Ebola situation now. And it talks about how much information we can request and when and whether we can take an employee's body temperature. Remember again, taking a temperature is a medical exam, and that's governed by the ADA, but asking an employee about their travel history is not something that's governed by the ADA. So it's not something you have to be as concerned about. So again, you kind of work your way down through the analysis. Direct threat, again, that's a concept that may come into play, and it's going to depend in large extent to how likely the exposure is to have occurred and what the potential risk is if there was an exposure. In the case of Ebola, chances are you could, depending on the facts, make a pretty strong case that a person poses a direct threat in the workplace, and you may be able to take them out. But you want to be sure you've thought through that and that you have good facts that you can base your decision on. Again, this is just information that you can obtain from an employee, and you can even make some of these inquiries safely and find out if they have flu-like symptoms. Flu is not a disability, so you can make those kinds of inquiries if you have someone in one of these risk categories or who's traveled to one of the areas that, particularly where Ebola is endemic. So those would not be disability-related inquiries if you made them. If you have employees traveling to Ebola-affected areas or near Ebola-affected areas, consider the kinds of things that may come up. Are there potential workers' comp issues that you have to think about? Well, international law is going to be different from state law, so you just have to take those things into account. Are you going to be doing more monitoring? Now, I think we have enough monitoring in place under the direction of CDC and under the direction of state and local authorities that you're probably going to have those measures in place, but those are things that you should think about. Some other things that may come up. What if an employee says, I refuse to travel, or I refuse to work with this employee who just returned from one of the affected countries, let's say? What if they refuse to work with them because they're afraid? OSHA says you can't just fire an employee if they express some reasonable concern about workplace safety, even if it turns out that their concern is unfounded. So you have to talk through the issue with that employee and see if you can demonstrate to them why you're allowing this person into the workplace, or why it's okay for them to travel, that this concern that they have is not something that they need to be as worried about. But you can't just come down on an employee and say, oh, you refused to work, you're fired. If they're expressing a legitimate, reasonable concern about workplace safety, that expression is protected and they cannot be terminated for expressing it. And what if employees refuse? In fact, there's a national nurses union, and this is kind of interesting, a national nurses union who's announced that they're going to be doing a national day of protests and strikes next week because of their concerns about workplace safety. Well, if they are banding together to express concerns about workplace safety, their actions may, and in this case probably are, protected under the National Labor Relations Act. So again, you have to think about that, and the first thing you want to try to do is talk with them about why they're concerned and try to help them understand why they shouldn't be concerned, because having worked in healthcare for a long time and still working with a lot of healthcare employers, I'm pretty confident that most of them are very focused on being prepared, just like we've heard from our speakers this morning, in being prepared if these situations arise. So you would want to talk to those nurses, but if you had to, you could let them be excused from work for a period of time, and you could replace them with other folks, because most of the hospitals I've talked to have teams of volunteers that they're now training to be their Ebola response team. But that, again, that's a situation and a knee-jerk reaction. Knee-jerk reactions are bad in almost every case. A knee-jerk reaction to say, well, you refuse to work, you're fired. Can't do that. You need to get the facts, talk to the employees. Just from an employee relations point of view, you don't want to do that. And from a legal point of view, it can present problems as well. So those are some of the issues likely to come up. Another one that has come up is if there were, and in this case there's not yet at least, if there was a vaccination, some sort of inoculation that you could provide for your workers and someone refuses on religious grounds, what can you do about it? You know, we've had that come up in terms of flu shots, and some workers have refused. Well, under the law, you can't just outright take action against that person or terminate that person. You've got to talk to them. You've got to understand what their concern is. Is there a way to accommodate it? And if it creates an undue hardship for the employer, then you may come to the point where you say, well, I'm sorry, we can't accommodate you. Or maybe you'll find an accommodation, but you have to think through it. Again, the knee-jerk reaction is what you want to avoid. So with that, I've rushed through a bunch of slides. Again, a lot of them kind of coincide with what you've heard earlier, but that gives you an idea of what some of the workplace issues likely to come up are, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much. We have time for questions of Mr. Krautman, and I'm willing to stay, Allison's willing to stay. We have this room until noon, so if there are additional questions, don't feel like that clock is ticking. Could I start with one again?
Sure.
Sheriff Garcia spoke at the beginning that he might lose half his officers. Okay? What I hear you saying is, and I'm concerned about EMS people as well, saying, you know, I'm not so sure about these protective gear. The nurses in Dallas were in protective gear and they got Ebola. What you're saying is that the employer cannot threaten to fire them so long as their fear has some basis. Is that fair?
That's basically fair. Now, I would strongly recommend that you talk with them and you can explain about what we've learned and the adjustments we've made in terms of providing protective equipment and all the things that we're doing to make for a safer workplace, and see if you can work through that with the employers and with the employees. But if for some reason you can't and they still refuse and they have some sort of a well-founded concern, you don't just outright fire them.
Other questions for Mr. Troutman? Workplace issues, there are going to be a lot of them. Yes.
I don't know if it's the workplace or workplace related to the school district. Let's say a child comes to school and they share with you that their parent has been to some
Okay, so the question just repeated for the tape is what to do about the child who goes to school and reports that their parents have been visiting Liberia or Sierra Leone or Guinea. Can the school pursue that and try to find out more medical information about the parents and what they were doing?
Yes, and we've had that question come up, and it's fine to ask those questions. It's fine to find out more. One thing that I didn't mention earlier, but that's important to bear in mind, there's a difference between what a private employer can do, what a private employer can say, as opposed to a public employer. A public employer is more limited in some of the things that it can do. But there's not a problem with asking more questions and trying to find out more information about where that family has been, because this gets back to the example we talked about a few minutes ago. Where have they been in Africa? Have they been in one of the 3 countries that in which the epidemic has really been rampant? Or have they been over on the other side of Africa? So you can ask some questions, and as you ask those questions and get more information, you may also consult with state and local health authorities, because I think they possibly already know about it, and if not, probably want to know about it, depending on the circumstances.
Yes.
Can employers require their employees to advise them in advance if they're going to travel to one of those Ebola-affected countries?
You know, the question is, can employers require their employees to advise them in advance if they're going to be traveling to one of the Ebola affected countries, or let's say one of the countries in which Ebola is endemic? You can have a policy along that line. You can certainly do that. I would probably recommend that you tailor the policy not just to the present Ebola situation, but to kind of a broader policy that talks about the importance of maintaining safety and health in the workplace and not bringing any kind of contagious conditions into the workplace. And here are some of our practices. And consistent with those practices and that policy, if you've been in a situation or you've traveled in a place where you've been exposed or may be exposed, we'd like you to tell us about it.
This is why he's a good lawyer. That's good advice.
So we've received lots of phone calls from various employers, schools, and so forth, who understand the CDC and DSHS recommendations, but they'd like to be extra careful, and they want to expand the definition of risk to, for instance, all of Africa in some circumstances, or countries outside of the 3 that are named. Can they reasonably do that? And what advice, obviously we need to have dialogue and education from the health department side, but can the employer do that despite the recommendations from local public health as well as the CDC guidance?
That's a great question. And basically, can the employers go beyond what the CDC guidelines say, what the state and local guidelines say in terms of who's high risk? Can they expand to those risk categories? Not without great risk. That's the short and simple answer. I would say that let's go back to the history of a lot of our civil rights laws, because the Americans with Disabilities Act kind of relates to those things. And if you go back into history, and let's go back to the very beginning, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. After passage of that act, if someone came along and said, well, yeah, I know this is what the law is, but I still don't want someone who's African American working for me, or some of my customer has made some kind of a complaint that they don't want to be served by an African American. You know what the answer is? Tough. That's wrong. That's illegal, and you cannot do that, and we don't tolerate it. So this is new. This is new ground. But keep that background in mind. Keep that background in mind, because if we stray beyond the current guidance, we're getting into areas that are legally much more risky. Most of the time, we're not doctors. And even if we are, what do we know that the CDC and the state and local authorities don't know? So I think it's risky to go further, but I will also tell you, particularly in something like Ebola, where the consequences of being wrong are so great, whenever you're dealing with employment issues, you're always weighing risk. You're always weighing risk. And some employers are more willing to take a little additional risk than others, which gets into things like the 21 days away from work after returning from one of the countries in which the Ebola epidemic is at that level. Okay, if somebody's coming back from one of those countries and they had close contact with someone who had Ebola, it may make sense to have that person stay away from work from 21 days. That makes a lot more sense than barring somebody from coming to work who was on the other side of Africa. Makes a lot more sense. So you're tipping the scales. It also helps if you pay that person when they're away from work than if you just say, no, you can't come to work, and too bad if you don't get paid. So you're constantly weighing the risk, and you kind of put weights on either side to determine what are we willing to do, what are we willing to think about, and what risk is acceptable for us. But the basic answer is, if you go beyond CDC and state and local guidance, you're taking risk.
And you'd agree that there's no more Ebola in South Africa than there is in Norway?
Based on my knowledge, I would certainly agree with that.
Right, so,
back to the school situation. The two nurses that came down with Ebola were considered low risk, and also evaluating one of the risks that there is motivation to not be truthful in your exposure level when you're asked this question. Do you think it would be higher risk for a school district to exclude a student for 21 days if they recently traveled to the high-risk country?
I think the school district, again, the question being, would it be appropriate, would it be risky if a student returns from one of those high-risk countries? I think you need to try to get more information. You need to, go ahead.
If I could just interject, the other thing is, just like the fact that there might be Ebola in Dallas does not mean anything much about Houston. These are large countries, and there are only, as I understand it, chunks of those countries in which Ebola is raging. There are some parts of those countries which, as I understand it, are as Ebola-free as Norway, to go back to that. And so that might be another thing that one might inquire into, is lumping all of Liberia together while is not probably the best idea.
And let me say, a lot of you have probably done the same thing. I talked to a lot of people in Dallas over the last 3 weeks. And there was a period there where it would not be an understatement to say that there was absolute hysteria in the whole Dallas area. Although we had just a couple of transmissions of Ebola, there was hysteria. Well, so in Dallas, you might be able to push the envelope a little further, same point you just made, than you would be in Houston or maybe in South Florida. So again, you need more information, but I know it's tempting. I know people, they're kind of afraid. But if you go back, look at the guidance has proved to be pretty good. And I have a lot of confidence in the hospitals, the first responders, people like Dr. Peirce. I have a lot of confidence in what they're doing and what they can tell us. And if you look at it now, they've done a pretty good job. Patient zero up there was could they have done some things better? Well, probably so. You can always do things better, but they did a lot of things pretty well, too.
All right, I'm going to take one more question, and then I'm going to give people an opportunity to depart in sort of a polite, orderly way. But for those who do want to stay around, let me just stress it. I'll encourage that. Yes?
For the employer, if you have differentiated, you have a control measure for the job, you ask the employee to stay away from the workplace for 21 days. Of course, if there's a control order, they have to. If there's not a control order, they don't have to. Would you run those 21 days against 12 weeks guaranteed under the FMLA? Or would you do that?
If a person is subject to a control order or not subject to a control order, and they're staying away from work for 21 days, would we? Maybe.
Would you run that against the FMLA?
I'll tell you, I think that's a close call because the FMLA says it's supposed to be for a serious health condition, and I'm not sure it makes a difference whether the employer requested it or the employee volunteered to do it. There's still a question as to whether or not that's FMLA covered. So I think you'd want to look at that a little more closely. My first reaction is if they're asymptomatic, that doesn't sound like it's an FMLA covered situation. So I probably not count that against their FMLA And I'll tell you,
There's a control measure issue so that it's not a voluntary situation whatsoever. Does that make a difference? Because most employers, if there's going to be a lot of leave and they have a multitude of employees, want to apply
sure.
21 days, that's over 4 weeks, to the FMLA time.
Although I'll tell you, I see lots of times where time is taken that could be classified as FMLA leave and it's not. But yeah, typically, if they're away from work for a medical type reason, you'd want it to be classified as FMLA leave. If there's a control order in place, there ought to be some underlying facts that are supporting the control order. So it would depend a bit on what those facts are. But again, the FMLA says that you have to have a serious health condition or you have to be caring for a family member with a serious health condition. It sets out criteria. If this situation doesn't meet those criteria, then to apply FMLA to this situation would really be going outside the bounds and would potentially be interfering with somebody's FMLA rights if later they needed more time. So I would not be inclined to do it without more information.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to give people an opportunity. I'm going to give anyone who wants to an opportunity to leave gracefully. But as I said, for those who want to stay, please do.
Great, that was great.
Thank you.